Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the release of MPI's new report, Credentials for the Future, Mapping the Potential for Immigrant-Origin Adults in the United States. My name is Michael Fix. I'm a senior fellow here at the Migration Policy Institute. I'm the former president. First, before I begin, a few housekeeping notes. I want to remind everyone that the audio from the webinar will be on our website later today at migrationpolicy.org/events. For any technical problems, please email events@migrationpolicy.org or call 1-202-266-1929. If you have any problems hearing via the web, please dial in using the call-in information sent earlier via email. And we'll have a written, not voice, Q&A at the end of the call. Please type any questions into the Q&A or chat box on the right side of your screen or email events@migrationpolicy.org. Or you can tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or #MPI discuss. As I say, we are excited and delighted that you could join Jeanne, Batalova, and me, and our three deeply expert speakers, Dr. Courtney Brown, Vice President of Strategic Impact at the Lumina Foundation, which supported this work, Dr. Brenda Dann-Messier, the former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education and now Commissioner for Postsecondary Education in Rhode Island, and Amanda Bergson-Shilcock, Upskilling Director at the National Skills Coalition here in Washington, D.C. All right. The report that MPI is releasing today is part of a larger MPI study project that's supported by the Lumina Foundation that addresses three interrelated issues that bear on meeting today's demand for skilled labor. Their need to develop talent among the nation's immigrant origin populations by making post-secondary credentials accessible, as we'll be discussing today. There's also a need to recognize talent by recognizing the foreign earned credentials of high-skilled immigrants, reducing what we refer to as brain waste. And then there's the need to retain talent that may well be lost by policies that would limit the rights and opportunities of DACA and TPS recipients. Our point here is that efforts to meet the nation's skills shortages should go beyond immigration policies to include the policies and practices that tap the talents of immigrants and their children who are already in the United States. Well, let me turn now to Jeanne's and my report. The report has, we think, several distinguishing features. First, it represents, we believe, the first ever attempt to estimate the number and characteristics of the nation's adults without post-secondary credentials. Our, to me at least, easy to remember bottom line is that there are 30 million immigrant origin adults ages 16 to 64 who lack a post-secondary credential, and they represent 30% of the 100 million U.S. residents without a post-secondary credential. Our analysis has been done by Immigrant Generation, and importantly, it's been done at national and state levels. Jeanne will be providing some highlights of the state analysis today, and MPI will be releasing the full state database and an issue brief based on it in 2 weeks. Second, the analysis also represents a first-ever estimate of the economic value of non-degree credentials for immigrant origin adults, including their effects on labor market participation, their effects on unemployment, and their effects on wages. And third, the report provides an analysis of the legal status, the English language skills, and the ages of those without post-secondary credentials, focusing especially on the rapidly growing population of older immigrants, 55 to 64. Before turning the floor over to Jeanne, let me just place this issue of credentialing the immigrant origin population in some political, economic, and demographic context. And let me start with the fact that there are more unfilled jobs in the U.S. economy than we have seen in years. As you know, as everyone on this call knows, the demographic challenges here are the demographic trends are challenging. We have perhaps the most rapidly aging population in U.S. history. Fertility rates are falling. And all told, population growth is the lowest that it's been since 1940. At the same time, the skill demands of the economy are rising. Estimates suggest that 68% of all job openings between 2014 and 2024 are projected to acquire some form of post-secondary credentials. Meanwhile, the number and types of credentials offered has proliferated, a proliferation that has led to a confusion among some employers and among would-be employees about the value of different credentials and where they place them on career paths. This confusion, in turn, has driven efforts to rationalize the system in order to promote transparency and to expand access to high-value credentials, especially for historically disadvantaged minority populations. This is an effort that has been led by the Lumina Foundation. Further, over 40 states have now committed to setting specific goals for increasing the number of workers with marketable credentials. These are states that will need to, and in some cases are looking to immigrant-origin adults to achieve these goals. But our report also points to several recent developments in immigration policy that may be creating headwinds when it comes to progress. These include a dramatic reduction in the number of refugees being admitted, with spillover effects for the refugee resettlement network. These include the release of a proposed public charge rule that could chill immigrants' use of federal means-tested federal public benefit programs that are linked to training programs that offer credentials. And finally, the proposed cancellation of TPS and DACA status for over 1 million persons will take away their work authorization and will, no doubt, reduce their incentives to build their own human capital. So, with that, let me turn the floor over to Jeanne Batalova, who will take us through the report's findings. Jeanne is a senior policy analyst and demographer here at MPI, where she oversees our very popular data hub. Jeanne?
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to present the results of our research, and I look forward to the discussion of the findings and their implications with our distinguished guests and all of you online. To put everyone on the same page, let me quickly go over some key terms we will be using. When we discuss first and second generation, we refer to an immigrant generation. The first generation adults or immigrants are persons with no U.S. citizenship at birth, and they include naturalized citizens, legal permanent residents, refugees, and other humanitarian immigrants, persons on certain type of temporary visas, such as foreign students and foreign workers, as well as unauthorized immigrants. The second generation is composed of persons who were born in the United States to at least one immigrant parent. Together, the first and the second generation adults make persons of immigrant origin. And finally, the third and higher generation, that's our important comparison group, consists of adults born in the United States with U.S.-born parents. When we talk about post-secondary credentials, what we essentially refer to is to any education or training earned beyond high school. And there are two types of credentials, degree and non-degree credentials. An example of a degree credential is an associate level vocational or academic degree, or a professional degree such as a medical doctor's degree. Common types of non-degree credentials include certificates awarded by educational institutions, apprenticeship certificates. They also include professional certifications and occupational licenses, an important type of non-degree credential that will be the focus of our analysis of the economic value that credentials bring later on. In terms of our research questions, we know from prior work that immigrant origin population will be the primary source of future U.S. labor force growth. Given the demographic and labor market trends that Michael described, an important policy question for us is, are immigrant origin adults who are the main replacement source of retiring workers prepared to fully engage in the knowledge-based U.S. economy? To answer this overarching question, we will explore how many immigrant origin adults reside in the United States, how many of them lack important marketable post-secondary credentials, what are their characteristics, like race and ethnicity and age, where do they live, and what are the main barriers they face accessing post-secondary credentials. And as I mentioned, an important question for us, we wanted to explore with new Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and that is on the economic value of degree and non-degree credentials for the immigrant origin population. All right, so what do we know from our data? Today, almost 58 million U.S. adults are from immigrant families. These immigrant origin individuals make up 28% of all U.S. adults ages 16 to 64, up from 21% in the year 2000. Owing to several decades of large-scale immigration to the United States and higher birth rates among immigrant families, this immigrant origin population has grown at a much faster rate than other U.S.-born adults. Immigrant origin adults compose a large but often under-recognized share of U.S. adults without marketable post-secondary credentials. As this chart shows, immigrant origin adults make up 30% of the 100 million adults without such credentials. Of these 30 million immigrant origin adults, about 19.4 million are first-generation immigrants, and about 10.6 million are members of the second generation. As you could see on the stacked bar on the right, of the 30 million immigrant origin subpopulations, a bit more than 9 million are those without high school degree. The next group is 12.9 million are adults with a high school degree but no further education. And then there is a 7.8 million immigrant origin adults. These are those who completed some college but stopped short of receiving a degree for it. This last group in particular is of importance, as these adults, these are the adults who have already made some strides toward higher education attainment. We also find that the majority of immigrant origin adults without post-secondary credentials are racial and ethnic minorities. Hispanics represent the largest group among both the first and second generation, followed by Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and Blacks. In absolute terms, 19.1 million Hispanic, 4.4 million AAPI, and 2.1 million Black immigrant origin adults lack post-secondary credentials. And because most immigrant origin adults without post-secondary credentials are racial and ethnic minorities, closing attainment gaps can contribute to the break in the cycle of educational and economic advantage and to reducing social inequality. An important dimension of our analysis is the age distribution. The large numbers of immigrant origin adults without credentials are adults in prime working age group, almost 19 million. The majority of them are immigrants, so they were born abroad. There were also significant numbers of younger persons, age 16 to 24, where the rapidly growing second generation predominates. And then the last important, smaller but still important group is the older adults, with 4.8 million, of which majority are the first generation. The needs of these different age populations have to be met in different institutions and in different ways because of where they are in their career and educational trajectory. This would include educations and credentials obtained through community colleges, adult basic education programs, and other education institutions, as well as through workforce development programs and employer-based upskilling initiatives. One important but not surprising finding for us was the high concentration of immigrant-origin adults without post-secondary credentials in traditional immigrant-receiving states. In absolute terms, 5 states accounted for more than half of the 30 million immigrant-origin adults. About 25% resided in California, 13% in Texas, about 8 to 9% each in New York and Florida, and 4% in Illinois. What this chart shows is that, whereas at the national level, immigrant-origin adults accounted for 30% of U.S. adults without post-secondary education, that share was much higher in these traditional immigration states, 58% in California, and above 40% in both New York and New Jersey. What did come as a surprise is the high share of these adults, not only in the usual suspect states like California and New York, but also in Nevada, Hawaii, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Arizona. The report we're releasing today will highlight some state findings, but please stay tuned for a fact sheet with more state findings and data snapshots for all states that will be out in 2 weeks. Lack of legal status and limited English proficiency have been identified by us and other researchers as 2 major barriers to obtaining and using credentials to their full potential. Unauthorized immigrants, TPS holders, and DACA beneficiaries are not eligible for federal student financial aid. Their ability to enroll and pay for post-secondary education is shaped to a large degree by state policies, with legal protections and financial assistance varying significantly across the nation. We find that almost a third of first-generation adults without post-secondary credentials also lack legal status. And we also find that a significant number, 16.7 million adults who lack these credentials, are also limited English proficient. If you may recall, one research question that we set to explore here was about the economic value of post-secondary credential. In case you're wondering if you should get a high-quality post-secondary credential because it will pay off one day, the answer is yes, absolutely. Extensive interdisciplinary research shows that higher academic degree attainment has positive and long-lasting impact on economic and social well-being, not only of the individuals who earn those credentials, degrees, but also on their families. In this study, Michael and I also examined the value of a certain type of non-degree credential, and that was professional certifications and occupational licenses. What we found is that immigrant-origin adults who hold certifications or licenses in occupations ranging from barbers to medical assistants to electricians to licensed practical nurses, these individuals have higher levels of labor force participation, higher incomes, and lower rates of unemployment than their counterparts that lack them. And with regard to labor force participation rates, the gains associated with having a license or certification were particularly high among younger 16 to 24 and older 55 to 64 adults, and for women of all generations. To us, this means that these positive outcomes really underscore the value of increasing access to non-degree credentials as a strategy for promoting mobility and acceleration of immigrant integration. Having a marketable, high-quality post-secondary credential is a good idea. I hope we establish that. But for 100 million U.S. adults, including 30 million immigrant-origin adults, there are multiple barriers in the way. Immigrant-origin adults share many of the same challenges that other adults face when seeking credentials and economic mobility. These challenges range from the affordability of training, the time pressures of balancing work and family obligations, access to child care, and the need for assurances that the investments they make will generate the returns promised. A wide range of federal, state, and local policies aim to address these challenges, and we will hear more about them from our panelists. At the same time, first-generation immigrants face unique obstacles to obtaining and using these credentials. Lack of legal status and limited English proficiency are the obvious ones, but others flow from changes in immigration policies under the Trump administration, as Michael highlighted. In sum, immigrant-origin adults represent a large, diverse, and demographically important population for U.S. overall and many, many states. The answer to our main research question is that many of the 58 million immigrant-origin adults are well-equipped to fully engage in knowledge-based economy. But the 30 million immigrant-origin adults without post-secondary credentials and the significant returns to obtaining them make clear that the national and state efforts to promote increased credential attainment of U.S. residents and workers will not succeed fully without ensuring that the attainment progress of the immigrant-origin adults is accomplished as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanne. That was typically excellent. Well done. For those of you with questions, please don't be shy and use the Q&A function and let us know. Our next speaker will be Dr. Courtney Brown, who's Vice President of Strategic Impact at the Lumina Foundation. The Lumina Foundation is the nation's largest private foundation, which is focused specifically on increasing Americans' post-secondary success. Courtney is an important researcher in her own right, and one of her roles is to make sure that the foundation uses data and research to work towards its important objective of moving the nation to a 60% credential attainment goal by 2025. And in service to that goal, the foundation has just released a very important Stronger Nation report, which Courtney may say a word about. So with that, Courtney, we turn to you.
Thank you, Michael. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. First, I just want to thank the Migration Policy Institute for this great work. You know, while there's currently a great deal of research in the field showing the benefits of post-secondary credentials, both for individuals as well as for society, there's limited to little research specifically focusing on the immigrant experience. This report is so important in helping us better understand how to help immigrants get the skills and education they need. You know, as we all know, inequality is growing and social mobility is falling. And those long-term consequences are dangerous. They're dangerous for our country and for our Earth. As Michael mentioned, the jobs of today and tomorrow are going to require a post-secondary credential. I'm sure you've all heard this, but this sobering statistic from the U.S. that from the end of the Great Recession in 2010 to last year, the U.S. economy added almost 12 million jobs. And of those jobs, 99% required a post-secondary credential. So the recovery never came to those in those low-skilled, low-wage jobs, and it's not going to. A good job, one that pays middle-class wages, offers a comfortable life with health care and retirement, now requires post-secondary learning. And not only are those knowledge and skills important in our economy, they're important to fully participate in American life, to hold a good job, to raise a family, to build safe and prosperous community. All of those are going to require some form of post-secondary learning. And the truth is, in the U.S., we all often pride ourselves with the fact that hard work and grit, you know, with that, anybody can have the American dream. And these days, the American dream isn't possible without a post-secondary degree or credential. So as that American dream continues to fade for far too many, the failure to increase the number of people earning degrees and credentials looks to be more and more the reason, I believe. One of the problems is opportunities for post-secondary success are unequally shared. So that means millions of Americans can't fully contribute to the nation's well-being or even just reach their own goals. The fact that not all Americans have access to high-quality post-secondary learning, and that race, ethnicity, income, and immigration status, among other factors, determine who does, is just not tolerable. By 2025, the nation's going to need at least 60% of the working age people to have degrees, certificates, or other high-quality credentials. So this is why the Lumina Foundation has been committed since 2008 to making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to all. And in fact, since that time, 42 of the 50 states, and Michael mentioned this earlier, 42 of the 50 states have also set ambitious attainment goals to increase the percentage of people who have high-quality credentials and at the same time close these racial and ethnic equity gaps. At Lumina, we hold ourselves, the nation, states, and communities accountable to this goal through an online tool called Stronger Nation. You can find it online at strongernation.luminafoundation.org. And there you can see the nationwide attainment rate. You can see state attainment rates and community attainment rates. But there you'll see that the national attainment rate has been climbing steadily year over year since 2008 when we first began this work. And the current rate is at almost 48%. And the same can be said for most of the states across the nation. We're seeing great increases. And yet, we still have a long way to go. Even if rates continue at this pace, we're still going to fall short of our national and our state goal by millions. So our work is just beginning for people who can't afford, can't access, and can't navigate education beyond secondary school. And often, these are people of color. These are immigrants. These are people living at or below the poverty line. One of the statistics, and you can see this when you go onto the Stronger Nation site, is the percentage of whites with post-secondary degrees are double those of Hispanics and significantly higher than African Americans and American Indians. That's a huge gap and one we have to address. We also know that with demographic shifts across the U.S., we're becoming more and more racially and ethnically diverse, and we have to address these gaps. We have to ensure that every person can fully participate in the economic and civic life of our country. It's imperative that individuals in these groups add skills and credentials at significantly higher rates. At Lumina, we call this the equity imperative. We believe it's our collective job to reach these students who hold so much potential and help them succeed by developing and deploying their talent. Stated more plainly, we say equity isn't an important component of the work. We believe it is the work. So it's not enough to just say that we need more equitable outcomes. We need to think seriously about equity and what it will take for higher education to assure everyone the opportunities they need and deserve. So just a few other numbers or statistics. Today's typical college student or the typical person pursuing a post-secondary credential is no longer 18 years old, fresh out of high school and headed straight to a brick building for 3 to 4 years. Here's some facts about students in the U.S. 37% of today's students are older than 25. Many of those students are struggling just to survive. Almost half of students are financially independent from their parents. Many of these students are working to make ends meet. But as we all know, it's impossible to work your way through college in the U.S. with a low-end job. So it's not surprising that graduation rates are much lower for these students. Then if we look at the U.S. population of adults with no education beyond high school, the outlook is less promising. As this data just showed us, many of these people are disproportionately poor, are from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, have limited English-speaking skills, or are recent immigrants. And these populations just aren't well served within the current education system. Many of these people want higher education. They want post-secondary credentials, and they're willing to work hard for it. So I see it that it's our job to help them succeed. The best way that we can ensure that more people in the U.S. achieve education and training beyond high school is to create new pathways within and outside of the education system that work for a diverse population. So as Michael and Jeanne have shared today, more than half of the immigrant adults lack a post-secondary credential, and they face many of the universal challenges the broader population of adults seeking education beyond high school encounter. They're facing the barriers of affordability, time constraints, competing responsibilities between work and family obligations, access to childcare, and so on. On top of that, they're facing unique challenges in language barriers, legal status, and other restrictions. Yet they represent an increasingly significant portion of today's students, as well as our future workforce. In quite a few states, immigrants make up at least 30% of the adults without a post-secondary credential. And as was pointed out earlier, this percentage is as much higher in 14 states. 12 of those states actually have a statewide attainment goal. That means that if we're going to increase the number of adults in the U.S. with post-secondary credentials and reach our 60% goal by 2025, we have to take into account this growing population. Our nation's approach to education and training after high school has got to evolve in tandem with America's dynamic demographic trends and economic demands. We must build a new learning system that is fair and easier to access and navigate for everyone, including our immigrant population. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you, Courtney. That was excellent, including the most eye-opening statistic I've heard in months, that 99% of the 12 million jobs created after the recession require a post-secondary credential. That's really, really a stunning number. Okay, we're going to turn now to Dr. Brenda Dann-Messier. Brenda is Commissioner of Post-Secondary Education in Rhode Island, a state of enormous interest to those of us who study immigration policy. Under President Obama, she served as Assistant Secretary of Education for Career, Technical, and Adult Education, and her accomplishments are just too many for me to get into in the limited time that we have, but I am just very glad to say that she has been a very great and longtime friend of the Migration Policy Institute, and thank you, Brenda, for being here.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that warm introduction, but more importantly, I want to really thank MPI for the tremendous work that you're doing, identifying the educational attainment level of immigrant-origin adults across the nation. I also want to recognize and thank the Lumina Foundation for their extraordinary leadership in helping states reach our attainment goals. It's very important work that Lumina has been doing, and I want to also thank them for being a great partner. We think the work that you've been doing here at MPI is extremely important to us in Rhode Island, and I know also across the nation. And let me tell you why. Excuse me. We have 3 key priorities in our state. One is to reach our very ambitious attainment goal that the governor set in 2016, that 70% of all Rhode Islanders by 2025 will have post-high school certification degrees and credentials. And the reason the governor set that target so high was because, excuse me, in Rhode Island, we know that over 70% of the jobs will require those post-high school certifications and degrees and credentials. And as you have seen from Jeanne and Michael's work, Rhode Island's immigrant population does not have a high enough attainment level. Excuse me. Excuse me. I'm sorry. So anyway, the governor set this very ambitious attainment goal in 2016, and when I came 2 years ago to the state of Rhode Island, there was not a plan to realize her very ambitious attainment goal, so we did a very deep analysis, and I'll get into that in a moment, but let me just quickly talk about the other 2 key priorities for our office. The second one is to make sure that we're also eliminating equity gaps, and as Courtney mentioned, this is an economic and social imperative for us in Rhode Island to make sure we're eliminating the equity gaps. And then we also want to make sure in Rhode Island that higher education is affordable for all Rhode Islanders. So let me talk a little bit about all of those areas and why this data and information analysis done by MPI is so helpful for us going forward. As I mentioned, when I became commissioner a couple of years ago, there was not a plan to recognize how we would realize the governor's very ambitious attainment goal. And so we did a deep analysis, and as you can see from the slide, we know that we have to increase our attainment goal levels by at least 90,000 additional Rhode Islanders. So we decided we wanted to look at the data to figure out how we could reach that goal. And as Courtney and also as my colleagues from MPI have mentioned, we know in the state of Rhode Island that we will not reach our goal unless we are more intentionally focused on adults. We've decided that there are 4 target groups for us within the adult population that we're working on in Rhode Island. 1 is the incarcerated, 2 are veterans, 3 are low-wage workers, and 4th are immigrant-origin adults. That you saw in Jeanne and Michael's work are 39% of our folks immigrant-origin adults do not have post-secondary credentials. So we immediately recognize that we have to more intentionally focus on adults. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But as a higher education office, it is our role to make sure that we have all the policies, programs, and services in place to serve all the students that want to access and complete post-secondary education. On further analysis, we also we wanted to also determine who are the adults out there. And we know that we have over 260,000 adults in Rhode Island without post-secondary credentials, certifications, and degrees. We've even done a further analysis and been able to identify that there are 110,000 who have some college and no degree, as Jeanne mentioned. And those are what we like to call the low-hanging fruit because they've had some experience in post-secondary education. And so, again, we need to have targeted strategies specifically for those adults who have some college and no degrees. We have 3 public institutions in Rhode Island, the Community College of Rhode Island, Rhode Island College, and the University of Rhode Island, and all 3 of our institutions have specific programs for adults who have some college and no degrees. We also know that there are over 150,000 adults who only have a high school diploma or equivalency. And so that is a big target area for us. And when I talk about the programs and services that are available and we're designing in Rhode Island, we are intentionally focusing on those adults who only have a high school degree or its equivalent. So we know quite a bit about our adult population. When we also looked at where we stood nationally in terms of our attainment goal, we're a little under the national average that Courtney mentioned. But then when we further disaggregated the data, it's not a pretty picture in the state of Rhode Island. And we have identified that we have huge equity gaps in our own state. We know that only 30.6% of African Americans have reached an attainment level that is satisfactory for successfully competing in our economy, that only 29.5% of Southeast Asians, that only 20% of Latinx students, and only 19.5% Native Americans have reached the attainment levels that are necessary. Those figures are totally unacceptable and have outlined for us the work ahead in the state of Rhode Island, the work that we must do to eliminate those huge equity gaps. And then, as I mentioned, affordability is a huge issue for us in Rhode Island, and we're very fortunate with our governor, Governor Raimondo, that she understands the value of a post-secondary credential, certification, and degrees, and has done everything she can to make sure that higher education is affordable. She established a Promise program, which is a free college program for youth immediately when they exit high school. They're able to go for 2 full years to Community College of Rhode Island. In this, she was just reelected, and in her budget request for her second term, she is focused on expanding the Promise program to juniors and seniors in Rhode Island at Rhode Island College this next fall, and hopefully during her second term, she will also have that available to the University of Rhode Island juniors and seniors who are Rhode Island residents. In addition to that, knowing what I just spoke to you about in terms of the demographics and the need to serve adults in the state of Rhode Island, the governor has also proposed to start an adult promise program where adults can go for free at the Community College of Rhode Island to earn an associate's degree or post-secondary certifications. And so she understands the demographics in our state and the importance of making sure that a college is affordable to all of the residents in the state of Rhode Island. And I was really very pleased that Courtney talked about the work that the Lumina Foundation has done and the fact that so many states have attainment goals. That has been the organizing principle for us in our work in higher education in Rhode Island. And I was talking to Michael and Jeanne and saying ahead of time, when I looked at all the numbers of folks who have signed up for the webinar, I was really thrilled that there were so many community advocates, so many community-based organizations and all participating in this webinar. And I'm urging you, as a state higher education official, I'm called a SHEO, the State Higher Education Executive Officer for the state. I'm going to urge all of you to lend your expertise and your understanding of immigrant-origin students and populations in the community at large, and share your expertise with us in the state so that we are much more intentionally focusing on immigrant-origin adults and helping us to reach our attainment goal. We're very committed to that in Rhode Island. We are always working with our community partners and community members to make sure that their voice is at the table as we're developing, as I mentioned, the policies, programs, and services that we need to have in place as a state higher education office to fully engage all of Rhode Island's residents and enable us to reach our attainment goal.
Well, thank you, Brenda. That was, as usual, excellent. It just made me think how lucky we were to have you in the Department of Education. And you do point out the response to this webinar and to our report was extreme, which has been very strong and very broad, has been extremely gratifying to us here at MPI. Our final speaker this morning afternoon will be Amanda Bergson-Shilcock. Amanda's Director of Upskilling Policy at the influential National Skills Coalition, where she leads the coalition's work on adult education and workforce policies. Prior to joining the National Skills Coalition, Amanda was Vice President of Policy and Evaluation at what I've always deemed the quite pioneering Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvanians in Philadelphia. So with that, Amanda, we're eager to hear what your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks to you and Jeanne for this amazing report, which has been really exciting to me since I was first able to get a peek at it. I also want to thank Courtney for the support that Lumina has given to this work, both through this report and more broadly through your work on supporting racial equity as part of your post-secondary credential attainment work. And Brenda, it's always such a pleasure to hear from you about the ways that a really visionary state higher education official is thinking about these issues and the questions you're asking and the data that you're disaggregating. So that's an exciting model and one that I hope that others around the country are taking up. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes before we get to the broader Q&A session talking about the policy implications of this report, or the sort of so what if you are a higher education, adult education, immigrant, or workforce policy advocate. And there are implications for all those groups of people I just mentioned, as well as others I've listed on the slide here. Knowing that we have hundreds of you listening from around the country today on today's webinar, and more will hear this in recording going forward, I just wanted to lift up a few major themes that I think are particularly important. First, if you are in one of the more than 40 states that have set a post-secondary credential attainment goal, the first take-home message, which has been said, but I want to repeat, is you can't afford to ignore immigrant and second-generation adults. They will be crucial in helping you meet your goal. And in fact, in many states, you won't get to your goal at all if they are not part of the solution. And that's not just the sort of usual suspect states in the sense of ones that have traditionally had large immigrant populations. I was really interested to note that we see Nevada and Maryland and Rhode Island and Connecticut and Hawaii among the states where there's really a substantial population of immigrant adults who could benefit from upskilling. And that takes me to my second point, which is we need meaningful on-ramps for English learners in particular, right? You can't just assume that your higher education or your post-secondary strategies are going to accidentally serve immigrants or English learners well. You need to be deliberate and intentional about that. And as Brenda mentioned, draw on your community-based organization partners and those who are close to the ground and close to immigrant communities and can help you develop those. Second, if you are an advocate for working adults in post-secondary programs, there's a couple of developments happening at the federal level where you could add some weight to the discussion right now. We know that some of the things that help immigrant and second-generation American adults succeed in post-secondary programs are similar to the things that help U.S.-born folks. That is to say, child care and transportation, issues with career navigation and choosing the right degree or certificate program. Those are really important, especially for busy families, particularly low-income families, where people have limited time and they want to pick exactly the right upskilling opportunity for them that's going to lead to a credential that has genuine value in their local labor market, so that there's really an employer in their community that's going to want to hire them when they come out the other end of that training program. So two things that can happen at the federal level, both have to do with the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, the opening up of Pell Grant money to be available for shorter-term credentials. We want to make sure this is for higher quality short-term credentials so that people are able to use their student aid money to help them get those credentials that local employers are looking for in the labor market. And the second, the Gateway to Careers Act, also a proposal that could be part of Higher Education Act reauthorization. Gateways could allow a new federal discretionary grant program that would go to community colleges and others to support things like those childcare, transportation, and career navigation services that are so important for immigrant-origin adults and for low-income and students of color more generally. Third, if you are an advocate specifically around achieving greater racial equity in post-secondary outcomes, you heard Brenda say it, but I just want to reaffirm how powerful it is to slice and disaggregate your data, right? If you have a post-secondary completion strategy that's working only for white students, I would argue your strategy isn't working, right? And you need to know whether it's working for students of color and for students born outside the United States. So looking at your own data is really, really important. And similarly, understanding the importance of what high-quality credentials look like while being mindful of the really painful history of tracking in this country, right? To make sure that students of color are getting the full range of advising and career navigation services so they can make wise choices that really reflect their interests and goals without being steered into credentials that might not be the best fit for them or might not have real value in the labor market. If you're an advocate for English language learners, if there's one thing I hope you're taking away from this report, it's the idea that this is a population to be reckoned with. The population is large enough that you can no longer, if we ever could, say, well, you have to have a baseline level of English skills in order to be able to get access to this post-secondary credential program. We really need to be thinking about integrated education and training strategies and on-ramps that are really meaningful, so that if somebody walks in the door and wants to participate in a nursing or a welding program, they have access to the ability to do that in a way that allows them to build their English skills at the same time, rather than being told you have to go off over here for a year or two or longer to get your English up to speed, and then you can come back and try to complete the career or technical training that you want to complete. And then finally, if you're somebody who works on labor market information, certainly you've been disaggregating data, but I would encourage you to think about this new data around non-degree credentials, the occupational licenses, the apprenticeship certificates, to really disaggregate that data by nativity and by race, and to think more about how your data can help inform your economic development efforts and vice versa, right? We know that workforce development is economic development. We know that economic development is workforce development. If you want to attract businesses and help the businesses in your community grow, they need to have a qualified workforce. And increasingly, that means a workforce with a post-secondary credential. I think it's really exciting that we have this national report, and it's even more exciting that in 2 weeks we're going to have the state-level data sets and analyses that Michael and Jeanne talked about at the beginning of this conversation. I'm going to turn things back over to Michael now to lead us through the question and answer segment.
Well, thanks so much, Amanda. We're opening the floor now. We have about 10 minutes for question and answer, and I'm going to invite people to use the Q&A function on their screen. You're going to have to be quick because we're going to have to be quick. So I have a few questions here. First, I think, Jeanne, you need to answer this. It's a kind of a question. Did you use your usual method at MPI to identify DACA and TPS recipients? And I guess the answer to this is that our analysis focused on the undocumented and didn't disaggregate DACA or TPS, and the data sets don't allow us to do that. Okay, another question is, will we be addressing self-employment as a legal option for immigrants likely lacking legal status? I think it's a very good idea. I think you can do it in the data, right? You can look at the outcomes of credential holders and people who don't hold credentials in self-employment.
You can. I mean, self-employment is a bit of a tricky concept to tease out because what actually means self-employed might vary, especially in today's gig economy with Uber and TaskRabbit and other opportunities like that. But that's definitely something to explore because what we know from immigration research more broadly is that when immigrant groups don't have meaningful access to mainstream economies, they turn to entrepreneurship, often focused in ethnic communities, but entrepreneurship and self-employment becomes an important venue for upward mobility.
I have a question for Amanda. Amanda, you talked about this is a question for Courtney, Brenda, and Amanda if they want in. You talked about the Jobs Act that's going to allow people to use Pell Grants to finance short-term credential acquisition training. How do you ensure that it's quality training? That was a critique that was mentioned in a recent op-ed in the New York Times.
Absolutely, and that's a really important question. There are different mechanisms for ensuring quality. The first is around accreditation, right, that institutions that are allowed to receive Higher Education Act funding, that is, institutions that are eligible to get student financial aid, are themselves accredited, and there is a quality assurance process there. But there are other mechanisms as well that can be used. And I think one of the most important things to think about is that these are not systems that are happening in isolation, right? That a short-term credential is also hopefully an industry-recognized credential. And so there's a feedback loop from the employers where there's some indication that there's some third-party recognition by employers that this credential has value. And there's different ways for employers to offer that feedback, right? It can happen through a sector partnership, an industry sector partnership in which employers in the same industry come together to identify talent needs and potential solutions. It can be something that is done using data analyses where states are now increasingly using their state longitudinal data systems to set up data dashboards so that students can actually look up what are my earnings if I earn this credential? How do I know that this credential is really going to translate into labor market success? And then the important point that I briefly touched on earlier with regard to high quality advising, right? You want to make sure that there's enough funding to support career navigation or degree advising services that are really informed and can help people pick opportunities that are genuinely reflective of both their interests as far as career pursuits, but also careers that genuinely exist in their local economies, right? If you're training in oil and gas, you could probably find a lot of jobs in North Dakota or Texas or some parts of Pennsylvania. You might not find a lot of jobs in other areas of the country. So having that connection be tight. But I think the important thing is, you know, that there's a whole effort going on right now, led by my colleague Amy Ellen Duke-Benfield at National Skills Coalition and supported by Lumina, to say, how do we define quality in non-degree credentials, and what are the kind of rigorous and thoughtful and careful ways that that can be defined, not just at the federal level, but at the state level. And so look out for more coming on that from National Skills Coalition later this spring, because I think it is a very important question, right? We don't want people to be getting credentials that don't help them get where they want to go economically and otherwise.
That's terrific.
If I might just add, Michael,
please, Brenda,
a couple of comments. I want to just reinforce a lot of the things that my colleague Amanda talked about. In Rhode Island, this is a very important issue for us. And we are working in partnership with our other state offices, our Department of Labor and Training, our Governor's Workforce Board, to ensure that we are really paying attention to the credentials that students are acquiring and to make sure that they're what employers need. And what we've put back up on the screen again is our public dashboard that we've put together and will formally release next month in partnership with our Department of Labor and Training. So individuals, institutions, employers can look at the value of credentials that they've acquired, the kinds of jobs that they're hired for as a result of those credentials, and the types of education attainment levels that they need in order to achieve those goals. So it's really holding ourselves accountable. It's publishing the information, making sure the potential students have the information. And Amanda talked about that. In Rhode Island, we're developing a very extensive portal so that potential students can find out the full range of career opportunities, career pathways that are available, and how strongly they're needed by the employer community and what the demand is for them in our regional local economy.
Great. Here's a question for Courtney. Courtney, does attending college but not receiving a credential, according to the research that you've commissioned, account for really anything? Some research says that, you know, not getting a credential and attending colleges leaves you no better off than simply having a high school degree, and that your time and your money were just pretty much blown. Do you have what's your read on that question?
That's a great question, and so you could probably read the research in many different ways. The credential is what is the most valuable. That's the piece that you can take somewhere else. So leaving without a credential, short of the credential, may get you a job right away, but when that factory closes or that job ends, you have nothing to move on to that next position. And so the research shows that having that credential alone has enormous labor market values in the long term. So you earn that much more over a lifetime depending on what that credential is. It's part of the reason, going back to the quality question, that when we think about quality, it's not just about getting a job, it's that it also has a pathway to further education. So we look at labor market outcome as well as further education. So we have to build more pathways, because this is really important for our vulnerable populations, for our immigrant populations, is we don't want to give them a credential that leads to a 6-month job that at the end of that 6 months, if the job ends, that person is then left empty-handed again. And so a credential in hand can lead to the next credential and the next credential. It increases labor market outcomes and continuous learning.
Let me tell you, here at MPI, we are faithful to our deadlines. I am sorry to say. We have so many really powerful questions here in hand, but we're just not going to be able to get to them. So I just want to thank our audience and this absolutely spectacularly good panel. I want to call your attention to the resources that are available on our website that are now appearing on your screen. Our slide deck will be available to all. And I just note that the audio from today's webinar will be available at www.migrationpolicy.org/events. And I would also encourage you to check out the related report available on our website, migrationpolicy.org, Credentials for the Future, Mapping the Potential for Immigrant-Origin Adults in the United States. And I would also note the following: any reporters on this call who need more information should call Michelle Middlestat at 202-266-1910. And thanks again for our great presenters, and goodbye.